Hi, welcome to Writing and Thriving with Sally-Shakti Willow. I am so excited to be joined today by my first ever and longest book writing client, Nicola Smalley. Hi, Nicola. Please introduce yourself and tell us about you and your writing.
Thanks, Sally-Shakti. So I live up in North Lancashire in the northwest of England. I I had the idea, or someone gave me a pointer to write a book, probably about 6 years ago, and I had absolutely no idea where to start. And I wrote down it on my to-do list, write book, and that's where it stayed. It's quite a big task, isn't it? It kind of get lost in a to-do list. And but I set the intention at a ceremony at Samhain, which is the Celtic New Year, that I wanted to write a book. And then within 6 weeks, you had contacted me on spec. Well, actually, you contacted my husband to say, "I've heard you want to write a book. Are you looking for a writing mentor?" So Jason wasn't writing a book, but I wanted to, and I didn't know writing mentors existed. And for me, that is the first thing around this: the power of the setting the intention and the support we can get from our spirit guides, from the other world, whatever you want to call it, to help us with this process. So you popped into my life. I think it was probably like 2019,
Mhm.
and and yeah, so it was winter solstice 2019, and that set me on my writing adventure. And I didn't call myself a writer back then, although I was a writer. I had been published a little bit in magazines and a few chapters in books, but I never saw myself as a writer, and I certainly never thought or had an aspiration of writing a book until that point. So you popped into my life, and we started to work together. And if I hadn't had you, the book, the book, and the other books that I'm now working on wouldn't have. I can't see how they would have come about. So yeah, I've got lots to
Wow.
say for.
I didn't just come out of nowhere, actually, because I'm remembering that time now. And I found you because I'd had a vision of my drum, which actually just behind me there,
Yeah, yeah,
wrapped in its silk. Um, I didn't own any drums, and I knew I really felt like I needed one. I felt like that there was a drum coming into my life, and I'd had a vision of this drum at Samhain 20. I think that was 2018
yeah.
actually.
18. It would be
Yeah,
18.
and I had a vision of this drum, and I knew that that was my drum. And then the next day, I saw your advert on Facebook just out of nowhere. Um, for your drums, that you the bespoke drums that you were making on the winter solstice that year, and it was a powerful winter solstice because it was a full moon as well, so it was the oak moon. So you made my drum, not only my first drum, but also my three drums over the years, as we're now going to be talking about your three books as well. But you made that first drum for me in ceremony on the winter solstice. And that for me is where our connection began. And then I was on one of your events, and I heard you mention a book, or I thought it was Jason. I thought someone mentioned a book, and I was just starting out at the beginning then. And I thought, oh, well, I'll just email and see if you want any help.
Yeah, it's just incredible how it all links together, because actually there's a bit that goes before that. It's like we're just totally connected and we never even realized, because I I've always wanted a camper van, but never had the felt like I had the money to get one. And I had an idea. My writing topic is one of my writing topics is around ancestral healing, and I was working on my family tree, and I was healing my ancestral line and finding the stories. And I had this idea: wouldn't it be great to sleep out at all my ancestral sites and watch my dreams? And so, in order to sleep out at my ancestral sites, I didn't want to get B&Bs or anything like that, because of the cost. And so I thought, well, I could camp out, but I don't want to be camping in a tent in just a farmer's field, because they're just going to move me on. So if I get a little camper van, then I can kind of stealth camp in all these places, and then watch my dreams. And so my personal trainer had just got a van for £500. I thought, I could do that. I could afford £500. So anyway, I found this. So it looked online, and it was a full moon. It was the full moon before your full moon. I looked online and I found a little camper van for £900, but we didn't have the money. So we thought, what can we do to make some more drums? I thought, there's a really good full moon new winter solstice alignment coming up. So we never thought of doing those kinds of drums before, putting them out as like a pre-order. And so we put them out, and you bought the second one. We actually did 4 pre-orders, and you were the second one. And it meant those 4 pre-orders meant that I could go and buy the van. and so and so then, and the little red van has been instrumental in the writing of the actual physical writing of my first book, and then the content that's come through for the second book that I'm working, which is kind of like it's not quite a sequel, but it's on a very similar thread. So it's all connected. We are just absolutely not in control, are we? We think we come up with all these ideas ourselves, but we really don't. So
Yeah, we're
yeah,
being woven
yeah,
in that web. And I want to go back now. I want to go back a bit further because let's just tell people who you are and what you do. Like, why were you having this crazy idea about doing an ancestor sleep out, and making drums? Where does this all come from? How does this fit into your life?
yeah. So I am a shamanic practitioner, and also trained as a body therapist and a well therapist as well. But previous to that, I had a career in the environmental protection around big companies. So I don't even like saying the word, but corporate sustainability. I just don't think there's such a thing nowadays. But I was deeply involved in it, passionate about it, but it was absolutely burning me out. And so I was starting to wake up to there must be a different way of like solving this. And also I was so deeply worried about the state of the earth that I realised that we weren't going to get our way out of it by the everyday thinking. We had to essentially find a God and pray. That was my original words. Like, we need to go to something bigger than us and a different state of mind. So it led me to exploring all different types of spirituality, and I ended up with shamanism and nature connection. So that's where I met my husband on a shamanic medicine wheel. And then we ended up doing a 2-year shamanic practitioner course training following that. So I did 3 years worth of training. And at the same time, I was finding my way out of a job that I enjoyed but found deeply, deeply stressful, working in the corporations and kind of taking the weight of their responsibility on me to get them to become more sustainable. So I was running these two things at the same time. But what I found extraordinarily difficult was leaving that career and that job. And at the same time, I was interested in my ancestral line. I was building my family tree, and I was doing a lot of work with my therapist around what kind of core language I could have inherited from my ancestors that was keeping me locked down in this belief system, which wasn't reality, which was there isn't enough. You can't leave your job, otherwise you'll hit crisis. And so I started to work with my ancestral stories to understand where this came from, because the belief patterns that we inherit are are not just kind of from our mum and dad's belief, if you like, but they're in every cell of our body through our DNA. If there's been unresolved trauma in our family line, then it then gets coded into our DNA, and then we're born with it and we live with it. And for some reason, and I've not fathomed out why, it becomes very pronounced. Sometimes our siblings seem to get away with it and they just get along with their life and it doesn't affect them at all, but then others it does. And with me, it really locked me into an unhealthy belief system, an unhealthy work pattern, and a job that ultimately wasn't my calling, although I believed it was. And so all these things wove together to the point that when I went on a business conference actually, around running a membership site. My husband and I run a big community, online community, around helping people bring this spirituality practice into their lives. And it was on that conference where he said, you need to write a book. And it would have probably been sensible to write one that was kind of all encompassing of what we did, like an introduction to what we do. But I went straight for no, I'm going to write about the ancestral story that speaks to me most about why I'm locked into this really difficult belief pattern. And so that was my first book, which you came to help me with, and it ended up being called The Path to Forgotten Freedom: Healing Unresolved Ancestral Trauma. And you helped me brilliantly with thinking up the structure, which is quite an unusual structure for a book, but has been proven to work really well, which follows the if women who run with wolves. Dr. Martin Shaw's written books with this format where you use a story broken up into parts or a series of stories, and then you tell the story and then you write the narrative afterwards. So that format worked so well for me, and I think works well for the reader because by our very nature we have evolved with story. That's how our minds work. So if we want to get a point across, we learn it through a story. And so I wrote The Path to Forgotten Freedom about my 3 times great grandmother who fled the Great Irish Famine in the mid 19th century. Excuse me, let's get a quick drink. And I tell her story, which I'd uncovered. No one knew about it in our family, about the trauma that she experienced. So I take it in her life in 4 parts, but then I talk about the circumstances that led to that happening, and then how it's still impacting on me now with my beliefs and my behaviours. It's quite a long answer to your question.
No, it's great because I really wanted you to bring in that title because you had just said the words unresolved trauma. So yeah, the book is The Path to Forgotten Freedom, Healing Unresolved Ancestral Trauma. And I know you also now teach courses around ancestral healing, and you run retreats around ancestral healing. And this has grown out of, the work that you did for the book, and obviously the research and the writing and the community around that. I was just remembering the photos of when you fulfilled all the pre-orders for the book, and I think you had like an enormous pallet of like 3,000 books arrived.
So we ordered 1,000. We took pre-orders for so we ordered 500. We took pre-orders and sold out the 500 before they even arrived. So yeah, so we ended up packing them all in the lounge, and then we ordered another 500, of which I've still got about 50 left.
Wow! And you sell them through your website?
Yeah, we did. I did go. I chose the route of self-publishing with help from yourself, and I got advice from someone else that I'd met around publishing and self-publishing. And I felt like I didn't want any company or any organisation to take my voice. I'd gone through, the whole book is about the opposite. It's about gaining our freedom and our power. And so I felt if I went through a publisher, they'd want to change it in order to sell books. They'd probably want to change the title. They'd want to change my voice. And because their objective is to sell lots of books, my objective was to tell my authentic story and the story of my ancestor, not how many books I could sell. And so I went down the self-publishing route, which then meant that they all turned up at my house. I did get I guess an agent, if you like. I forget what they're called now. They're like a book distribution. I did go down a book distribution route. They're set up for small authors, and they're based over in York. And I did that so that I could get in front of bookshops, because the only way to get into bookshops is to go through an organisation like that. And so for a while they were distributing for me, but I've brought it back, and so they're all back home now, because of course they weren't pushing the book. It wasn't in their interest to push it. And so I deal with all of that myself now as a self-publisher.
Yeah, and as you do, for the whole of your business, really, the things that you post out to people around the world, like drums and rattles and things, have gone all the way around the world. I bought one of your rattles and gifted it to a colleague of mine. So there's this whole kind of like physical network as well of these objects that have gone out around the world. Tell us a bit more about how you wrote that book. You mentioned that your little red van, your ancestor sleep outs. I'd love to share with people about the shamanic aspects as well, and the ceremonies that you did that were part of your healing. Because I think one of the things we might go on to talk about is how that process of writing a book is very transformational for you as a writer. As we were working through the book, one of the dimensions of the content and the structure is how your story was changing throughout the process, and there's an aspect to writing a book that's very alchemical, that for me, I strongly believe that we can only write the book, or we can only complete the book when we're ready, when we've processed enough or transformed enough of what needs to be, of the inner work that needs to be done within us, in order for the book to then have a clear channel to come through, or for you to become the leader who's going to then teach on that subject and guide others through their own transformational process. So that was quite a big question, but can you talk us through some of the aspects of writing the book and working with the material?
Mm. Yeah, so I want to explain with a story because they're always the most tangible, aren't they? So I'm in supervision. I've got a therapist, Jane, who actually I did my training with, shamanic training with, so she knows me inside out, and we've been working together a long time. And I was working on writing the book and having therapy sessions at the same time. And there was one of the themes of the book, well, one of the main themes of the book is that is is illustrating that when our ancestors lost the rights to their land, access to their land, and the ability to grow their own food, that was a process of disempowerment and oppression and control, because they could no longer be self-sufficient, no longer have autonomy and power over their decisions over their own lives. They then became like a workforce. And this happened to my ancestor Catherine when she was in the Great Famine and emigrated to London. And I was writing chapter 4, and it's about oppression and control and shame, and the shame that she experienced when she came to London as an Irish woman, who then her husband died, and she then became a fallen woman. She became pregnant, and she lived on the streets of London, and then very sadly she ended up in the workhouse. Now that life is extremely shameful. Through a Victorian lens, there aren't few people that would be lower than her in people's perception. I think possibly if you're a woman of colour, but and maybe there's a few other categories there, but this was extremely shameful, and that shame then got passed down my family line. So we never knew about her. The story that we got was that my great great grandfather came over as a road builder for work, but that's not true. He was born in London and grew up in a workhouse. So, and he lied about who his father was on his birth certificate. So no one probably ever knew the real story. And this is the shame that comes through in us. It's like mercury. We can't grab hold of it. It disappears, and it then shapes how we think about ourselves. And there was an instance that happened when I was actually writing chapter 4, which was around, and I was writing about this that the people who are in control own the land and make the decisions, and we respond to them. And in that moment of writing that chapter, there was an issue around our neighbours. So back then we owned a little workers' cottage that used to belong to the manor house next door, and the manor house owns all the land, and our garden backed onto their land, and they decided to turn their field that we backed onto a dog walking field, which sounds absolutely lovely, and it is great if you're a dog walker and you just pop there every for half an hour every week to give your dog a run around. But the problem for us is that for every half an hour there was a new set of people walking right next to our fence, shouting for the dog, calling for the dog, playing with the ball. So it was like being next to a park constantly from like 9 in the morning till 5 at night. And it massively affected me and my writing process, because this was during the pandemic. We weren't allowed to go very far to go and write. The countryside was very busy where we lived. We lived in one of those honeypot locations where everyone from Bolton came to where we lived to go for a walk. And so my writing space was my garden at that point. but I couldn't write in the garden anymore, because I struggled to write indoors, because every 5 minutes there was a person walking past, either shouting at their dog or trying to talk to me. so so we raised this with our neighbours, and they didn't budge. I know it was their business, wasn't it? And it felt it all of a sudden right in front of me. It was like that disempowerment because I don't own this land. And that was the story. That's the story of like how my life was getting massively impacted because I don't own that land and I don't have any decision making on what happens on that land. And that was a perfect example of when someone's rich and they own all the stuff, how they have all the decisions and they don't need to consider us. It's quite a long-winded example of explaining how material came up for me to really understand the dynamic of power and powerlessness. I was powerless in that situation to change anything. They didn't even negotiate to get their clients to walk somewhere else in the field. You know, they were just, no, that's what we're doing. And so then, you know, in the pandemic, we were very sensitive to our local environment, of what was going on. You know, everything was heightened, wasn't it? And I was like, where am I going to write? Where am I going to write now? You know, I wasn't laughing. It was like a massive stress. And it helped me tap into what life was like for our ancestors when they, all of a sudden, the carpet got taken from underneath their feet and they just had no choice, and it massively impacted their lives. It massively impacted them to the point of starvation, being forced out of their country, being forced into essentially a prison for the poor, having their children taken off them. These are massive. It just affected my writing for a few months. You know, the scale is different, but the feeling of disempowerment that really came through. And it helped me understand shame, because the shame didn't sit with my ancestors. It sat with the people that set the policies that then created the situation when my ancestors ended up making choices, or not even having the ability to make choices, that were then seen as very shameful behaviour. And so, like I said, shame's like mercury, but I felt like I could grab hold of it through story and through my own process, through my writing process. Yeah.
I mean, I see this come up a lot when I'm working with people who are writing their books, and there is a deep layer of something that usually arises in their own life that shows them what they need to move through in order to really be able to write this next part of the book, and to complete that process, because it's an internal process as much as an external process. In order to complete the external process of writing the book, you have to actually complete the internal process of the thing that you're working on, even whether you knew it or not. You mentioned shame a couple of times there. Could you explain briefly how you said that shame gets inherited through the family, and you also, I think you could say a little bit more about who it belongs to, and how it gets inherited.
Okay, well, so there's an emotion there, and if someone doesn't pick it up who really owns it, it's there for someone else to pick up. So the shame sits with the government, with the landowners. What happened to our ancestors sits with them, but they're not picking it up. They didn't pick it up then, they're not picking it up now. And so then it's there, so someone else will come in and pick it up, and it's the down, in this scenario it was like my ancestors, it was the what had happened to them that then caused them into this situation. They then picked up the shame of that. It gets inherited through our DNA. It's quite extraordinary, this, and the best way that I can explain it is by using a bit of science, because we're into the realm of epigenetics, which is relatively new science, like decades old. And what they discovered, and you can't believe that they actually thought differently, but they discovered that when you look at our DNA, only 2% is actually responsible for the colour of our hair, our eyes, our shape, our faces, how tall our shape of our bodies. So the bit where you say, "Oh, she looks like her mum," that's only the 2% of our DNA. The other 98%, they didn't think had a purpose or a function, and they called it junk DNA because it was pointless. Now evolution wouldn't come up with 98% of waste, and it wasn't that long ago. It might have been the 80s, but then it got picked up again a few decades, a decade later, and given some energy, where they actually realised that this other 98% actually is responsible for everything else. So, and our beliefs. So when you look at a family, you think, well, my granddad's like that, and my dad's like that. It's because it's in the DNA. And I've got an example, just a bit of science to help illustrate this, and it's not particularly nice because it involves animals in the laboratory, little mice, and they get an electric shock. This is as bad as it gets, but they get an electric shock when they are subjected to the smell of cherry blossom. And then they react in a physical way to how you would if you had an electric shock. And then they have babies, and those mice don't ever get an electric shock in their life, but whenever they smell cherry blossom, they start to have a physical reaction as if they've had that shock. And then they're you know where I'm going with this. The next generation, they respond the same as their grandparents, but they've never experienced an electric shock. So there's this understanding within them that if they smell this scent, they need to react like that, and that's what we're dealing with when we inherit through our DNA, is that we need to behave like this if this thing happens to us, or if this is just how we respond. And the thing is that it can be trained back. We can train the DNA one way, we can train it the other way, but from my experience, I mean, there's lots of different ways that people work with this, but my experience, the way I work with, is that actually we need to have an awareness of the story that are, for the mice, it would be my grandparents experienced this is why I'm reacting to it, and it's not relevant anymore. I don't need to react like that. And so this is the work we're doing with uncovering ancestral stories, is looking at, well, where does this thing originate from, so that we can then recode our DNA so that we're not doing that thing anymore. And for me, it's trauma through through shame, trauma through being so poor that if you don't work and work and work, you will end up in the workhouse, which there are a few things that were more shameful than that back in Victorian England, and more terrible. I mean, people went to prison before they wanted to go to prison before they went to the workhouse. They got fed better and had better conditions. So we had this structure that was set up that was deeply entrenched in shame. And so even if your family never went in there, you would do everything you could to not go in there. So and these places were set up really to put everyone that had their land stolen off them ultimately. And that's the shame. The shame's with the landowners and stealing the land, but the shame got left with the people that were so poor that they weren't able, through circumstances, to support themselves anymore.
And in a way, it's like the shame is projected. So you get these people who come and they take the land, and they're violent and repressive, but instead of owning the shamefulness of their behaviour, they project that onto the victim of that behaviour, and they make the victim feel ashamed for being poor and supposedly incompetent and all of these other things. And then that's the level of shame that they're carrying. And there's also the layer of survival in that, being having been put into a position of poverty through the land and the resources and the communities being broken up and extracted, then their means of survival, their literal physical biological means of survival, was extremely uncertain and extremely vulnerable. And so then they had to, and I'm getting all this from your book, by the way, it influenced me so much when I was working with you. I learned so much, and so their survival depended then on them continuing to enact that shame, so that they would debase themselves, and they would have to behave in a way that conveyed that sense of shame and uh, poverty in order to get what was given to them or what was left over that could be available to them, when actually what you write about in the book is that, you know, one and two generations before that, and up until one or two generations before that, they had everything they needed. They had their resources, they had their land, they had their community, they had their family, and their way of life had been unchanged for generations. And suddenly they had to learn how to survive in this new, very cruel and violent world where their only means of survival was actually their shame and humility.
Yeah, you've nailed it.
Yeah, I literally really learned that from you. Um, so you are, we're now together working on a couple of books simultaneously, although we're sort of taking them, weaving them in and out of each other. There's a book that draws upon some of these similar threads, and you're working with another ancestral story. And then there's the book that you've written whilst you were on your walks on the Yorkshire Dales. So again, maybe you can tell us a little bit about your writing process for these newer books, and how have you been kind of, again, weaving those elements together, being out on the land, doing your ceremonial practice, and bringing the threads of the book into place.
Mm, yeah, okay. So it's actually there's been a development which is actually is I'm working on three books at the same time, which I'm pretty sure you've never said it, but I'm pretty sure I would recommend anyone to not do that. um, but when I said, oh, I'm writing this book, Severance, we're working on Severance, which is following the ancestral work, but here in England, because although so many of us have Irish roots, actually the story of the enclosures and the severance from our English land is going to be through most of us, all of us that are born into the working class families. It will be there. But I think for me, it's now really fired me up even more than the Great Famine, because it's not told. If you learn about it, I learned about it in school, that it was a necessary thing to make the country more efficient, and a few people got inconvenienced, but you know, whatever. I mean, that's generally, and as I've researched it, I found that actually that was a narrative that was put out, rewritten and put out in the Thatcher years, because it doesn't really sit very well when we start saying we starved our people and wiped out an entire class within a few hundred years. It doesn't really serve the British story. I mean, we do that to other countries, but we don't, you know, it doesn't sit well that we with people probably that would do it themselves. So they've covered up that story, I believe. So I'm bringing that through. And the way I'm doing that and working with the themes of that is I'm doing the sleep out where I got that van 7 years ago, whatever it was. And I got sidetracked with, I got sidetracked with two things. One was my story, Path of Forgotten Freedom, and my Irish ancestor. But also I got sidetracked with going on holiday in all these lovely national parks rather than sleeping out at my ancestral sites. It was much nicer. So the way I'm doing it is by going around I found all my 7th generation ancestral sites, and I picked 7 generations because in Native American philosophy or thinking, they make decisions based on 7 generations time. So about 250 years. So if I make a decision now, how will that impact 7 generations? And I found that very interesting when I worked in sustainability, because if you work in a business, they might not even be thinking 7 months in advance. Certainly not 7 years. They might have a 3-year business plan, but the third year is pretty sketchy, and so is really the second year. So we're making all these decisions now, but we're not thinking 250 years in the future. So I thought, well, what were my ancestors able to make decisions on, or what was going on 250 years ago? And that's when I discovered it was the enclosures, where they were losing the ability to make any decisions around their autonomy, their ability to support themselves. All of that was taken away. So that's why I picked my 7 generations. And the process is simple. I just went round, researched, and just saw what stories came through when I visited and what my dreams were telling me. So what this was telling me about the impact of power and power being taken from ancestors, and how that's playing out still in our lives now. So that's severance, and that's not been easy. There's something I think that's happened to my brain in the 6 years or 7 years between writing Part of Forgotten Freedom and now. And so it's not been that easy. And I don't think it's because I'm busier, because I wrote that book in the pandemic when our whole business was falling apart. We ran a retreat based business and they all ended, they all got cancelled that year. So at that time. So I don't think it's that. I think what's happening is, what I've researched is our brains are physiologically changing because of social media and because of the attention deficit, like lack of ability to focus. And so I start writing. I'm going to do all, and so I've had to work with that. So I think, and also I think possibly the enclosures has been a harder topic to research because it's not as well written about as the Great Famine in an accessible way. We're going into textbooks from the late 1900s, late 1800s, and books that are written in the 1930s. We're going back to then to get an insight into what's really going on. So that's been one book, but at the same time as starting to work with that with you, and I think I managed the introduction possibly, and then I was like, oh, Sally-Shakti, I've got this other thing going on. I'm starting to walk the Dale's 30 Mountains. And at the time, I couldn't see that the books were connected, but they absolutely are, because one of the things that we've lost is our connection to the land. And through my book, which I'm calling Heartland, and it's about my way of developing a relationship with the land to help me overcome my unhealthy work ethic that I've inherited from my ancestors. So the thought process that happened when I set about climbing these 30 mountains, and even to the point of, in the moment of seeing the book and getting really excited, I thought, I haven't got time. That mantra, I haven't got time, it's not worth it, it's not productive. For what end? You shouldn't be enjoying yourself, you shouldn't be playing. All those things are an inherited core language that has come through from my ancestors that were terribly poor and got forced off their land. So by walking the Dale's 30 Mountains and going through that process of, there's 30 of them, over 8 months to achieve it. Well, I did it in a year, but it took me 4 months to get around to it. So because I kept on not giving myself permission. So it's about my process of noticing these unhealthy beliefs and then working through overcoming them, so that I actually, by the final 4 mountains, I'm actually going, do you know what? It doesn't matter that I'm just going to take 4 days off, and I'm going to enjoy myself, and I'm not going to take my laptop, and I'm not going to worry about emails, and I'm not going to worry about social media, and I'm not going to, I'm just going to put this first. Whereas the first few, I was trying to get them done as quickly as possible to get back to work. So it documents that process. And it also talks about my challenge with my body, because through an unhealthy work ethic, I wasn't looking after myself. And so I then developed various problems. And then by putting myself first, I fixed those problems so that I could actually climb mountains, whereas before I couldn't. So it links up that about where we don't, on the spiritual path, we recognize, actually, do you know what? I'm not looking after myself here. I'm not putting myself first. I'm letting everything else take precedence rather than me. So it addresses that narrative and talks about how I overcame it. But on the last, as I finished it, I then thought, what would it be like to walk them all together? And so that's where the third book's come in, which I thought was going to be part of Heartland, but I had an epiphany the other day, because I actually wrote the third one as I was doing it, but I was going to incorporate it into Heartland, and you said, just put it down, Nicola, and and then just come back to it. And I'm glad I did, because it's a third book and it's called Mountain of Light, or something like that. And it's about going on a pilgrimage. So this is actually specifically going out into the land with the sole intention of connecting and building a deep relationship with the land. So I went for 2 weeks. I joined all the mountains up. I created my own route, and I walked for 2 weeks, stopping in pubs, in B&Bs, and a few campsites. Jason came over with a camper van, because some places there weren't B&Bs. And through that process, connecting a very deep relationship with the land, and one mountain in particular that I had as my last mountain, Ingleborough, which is my favourite mountain. And so it was a pilgrimage to Ingleborough, taking in all the other mountains. And I walked the distance of the coast to coast path, and I walked the height of the Pennine Way, which is 1.5 Everests, on my own. And in Heartland, I talk about overcoming fear of climbing a mountain on my own. So the fact that then a year later I did 30, and I walked for 2 weeks, and some days I wouldn't see anybody for maybe 11, 12 hours. It's really, really remote up there. But that connection with the land. And what I found was by day 4, I'd worked out a process where I was, rather than trying to, when you're walking and climb mountains, often you're trying to get to the end. It's like, how I need to get to the top and then the bottom. Whereas instead, I got to the place where I just walked as slow as I needed to spot beauty and write about it. So I'd write a poem as I was going up, and then read it to the summit of the mountain, what I see as the spirit of the mountain. And that shifted my mind from left brain to right brain, which is actually exactly what happened in reverse when we lost our land. When we lost our land, as ancestors lost their land, they then went to work and they became a unit of productivity. That's what a job is. It's like, you've got to do this in this amount of time and earn this person this amount of money. And when they had land and they didn't have jobs, they didn't need to do that. So every day was not about that. It wasn't. We can't imagine it, but it's only been 300 years that we've had this. Okay, what do I need to do today? What's productive? What's worth it? What are my goals? How much money do I need to earn? What are my objectives? Whereas that wasn't the way our ancestors thought back then. And that's been the instrumental part of this whole process. I wanted to understand what we lost when we lost our land. And by doing that pilgrimage, I worked it out. But it took 2 weeks. It took 2 weeks of wandering around with no one to talk to but myself and the mountains, to get that realization and get the connection with the land that I believe our ancestors had, that is so difficult to get when we're indoors, or even just walking locally for an hour. We need to be out there and with intention, connecting with the land. And our ancestors had that because they worked the land, they lived the land, and they were in community with the land. And we've lost all of that. So Mountain of Light is about getting that back.
Oh my goodness! Wow. First, we just have to say hello to Blue.
This is Blue. He really likes Zoom meetings.
He loves being on camera.
He really loves it. Yeah, he loves it.
But he's never been to one of our meetings before. I feel very honoured.
He hasn't, has he?
No.
He probably wants some food.
Oh, bless him.
I don't know. Well, actually, what's happened is that since the winter solstice, I've been writing every day on severance, and I've really worked through some of my blocks that I had around my writing process for a few months. And one of the ways is by coming down here in the morning, and before I do any work, I write for a minimum of half an hour, sometimes 2 hours. But because I've been spending a lot of time in the lounge, Blue has as well. So we've got this very close bond now. So I think that's what's going on. Is he's seen Nicola's in the lounge. I'm going to come out, hang out with her. So.
She's the most beautiful cat, really.
Oh, I would just say, if anyone's thinking he's looking a bit thin, he's 20.
Oh,
and he's a bit. We've had a few issues with him with his food. So I always point that out on Zoom now, because I think, gosh, they're not feeding. We believe who we really are.
I know. I thought he was looking muscly. Yeah. Okay, let's get back to the writing. And you just mentioned, working through some of those blocks. I wanted to say that, what I'm hearing from your story and what I know from working with you is that, when you're working on a book, it's a whole process. We've spoken about this. It's a whole process that includes, all levels of your being, all levels of your experience, everything that's coming through you is going into that process of creating this book. And through your teaching at the Way of the Buzzard, you share these practices with your community. So, you're not leaving people stuck in that ancestral story. You're sharing your personal story because it resonates with so many other people who had very similar ancestral experiences and who have inherited very similar experiences and are working through those now in this generation, which I believe is here to really do a lot of that healing so that we can move forward with a new narrative. And you mentioned being on your I'm going to call it a pilgrimage, walking across the Dales, which I know as part of your process, you went into that with a more spiritual intention, to connect with the mountain, and with all of the mountains. You were specifically, whether intentionally or not, but you were changing the narrative, that you were changing the narrative that you'd inherited by doing that work and by doing the walks and by writing the books. And so you bring through this possibility for transformation, where your commitment to writing the book is actually helping you to change your narrative, and then you can offer that to your community with practices and processes that they can also try, to help them change their narrative if that feels resonant.
Yeah, exactly. All of that.
Oh, Nicola, well, I want to thank you for your time today, and give you some time to feed Blue if he needs feeding. Um, it's been so good to talk to you, and I know we could talk for hours about your books, your creativity, your practices, and everything that you're doing and bringing through. Let's just finish by letting people know how they can find you, and where they can look you up.
Oh, thank you, Sally-Shakti. So my husband and I run, so Jason and I run The Way of the Buzzard, which is it's we've got a website, thewayofthebuzzard.co.uk, and that's our kind of overarching. You can find everything there. And then at the bottom of the homepage, you can enter your email address, and then we'll just keep you updated with everything. But through that, you can find the Ancestral Healing Masterclass, Ancestral Echoes. You can find our online mystery school, the community that we run, where we teach everything, everything about Indigenous spirituality here in Britain, nature connection and shamanism. And you can also find Path to Forgotten Freedom, which is on under books. It's the only place at the moment where we sell it. We've taken it off Amazon, so that's there as well. And then if anyone's interested in the sacred tool size, you've mentioned about that, then you'll find that under the shop. I think it's shop, and you click on shop, and then it comes up with books and sacred tools
And that's for
things.
drums, rattles, and other things that you make. Ogham, you make
Yeah.
Ogham collections, sets. That's it. I've got an OM set, but not one of yours. I didn't know you then. So it's like those are divinatory sticks based on the Celtic OM, the circle of trees. We won't go into that part yet. So you're very multi talented, multi skilled. And I just wanted to say as well, if anyone does sign up for your newsletter, it's really worth, it's really worth receiving. You get the stories, the news, the videos, and all of the parts of the process that Nicola's been sharing with us today. So it's really worth looking out for those. Thank you to Nicola and to Blue. You can all find me at writingthriving.com or on Substack at Writing Thriving. And I look forward to seeing you all again next time.
Thank you.